All right, I think we can start. Good evening and welcome to our members and especially our new members, which we have quite a few that have joined recently, and hopefully members to be, to our first lecture of the new season. I'm Deanna Canini, president of this very engaged organization. Please join me in the excitement too. I think many of you have mentioned it, this our new location. Hopefully it'll work this evening. It seems like everyone is pleased to date. We also need to express our gratitude to Ginny Pitsley, who is sponsoring this lecture in memory of her husband, Bill, and their son, Jay. Additionally, thank you. Additionally, I want to thank all our dedicated, supportive members who gave to our annual appeal. We have received over $23,000 towards our efforts to refresh our interpretive center, so we may continue to vibrantly, whew, wrong one, to vibrantly tell the stories of the Irish in Newport County and all their accomplishments and contributions. I invite you all to visit the center if you haven't already. I just want to make some announcements or notes of interest. The first one, the Bonnie Street Cemetery Tour, led by our own Steve Marino, was such a hit last March that it has returned this fall. We had the first one on September 11th, and we have 3 more scheduled September 25, October 9, and October 30. They begin at 1, and you can make a reservation on our website. Come and learn about the final resting place of many of Newport's early Irish immigrants and Rhode Island's first Catholic church. The tour lasts about 30 minutes. For your information, the cemetery is located at the corner of Mount Vernon and Bonnie Streets behind the Newport Historical Society. Second one, the Interpretive Center is still open. We're closing for the season on October 30th. As a reminder, we are open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and Sunday, noon to 5. The museum is at 648 Thames Street. Again, if you haven't visited the center, I ask you to. You may see a family member featured, or maybe a member of a neighbor or a friend's family, or gain an appreciation again of the contributions of the Irish in Newport County. Also, we have 2 more lectures, as you know, scheduled for this year. On October 18, a lecture by Ray McKenna regarding chain migration to Providence from particular counties in Ireland. And then on November 14th, Kurt Schlichting will be returning to present the Irish in Kerry Hill. And lastly, and don't forget, we have 3 walking tours of Irish Newport. They're self-guided and take you throughout Newport. They are available at the museum or on our website. Now, the highlight of the evening. We welcome back Dr. Elizabeth Stack, the executive director of the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany, New York. Excuse me. The mission of the museum is to preserve and tell the story of the contributions of the Irish people and their culture in America, inspiring individuals to examine the importance of their own heritage as part of the American cultural mosaic. As I reported when Dr. Stack spoke to us in February via Zoom, the Albany region contains 1/4 of residents to be Irish heritage, to have Irish heritage, making it one of the largest concentrations of Irish Americans in the country, very similar to Newport County. Dr. Stack is a native of the town of Listowel in the northern County Kerry near the Limerick border. She earned her master's degree in Anglo-Irish relations in the 20th century from the University College Dublin and taught history in Ireland prior to moving to New York in 2009. Dr. Stack earned her PhD from Fordham University, writing about Irish and German immigration in New York at the turn of the century. At Fordham, she served as the associate director of the Institute of Irish Studies. Dr. Stack has chosen to help us understand how the injustices in Ireland during the 19th century spurred the activists who immigrated to America to fight for a more equitable society. As she quotes Daniel O Connell, nothing is politically right, which is morally wrong. Please welcome Dr. Stack, tonight's lecture, Immigrant Activists, Irish Americans Who Built a Better Society. Dr. Stack.
So I just wanted to refer again to the generous gift from your sponsor here, Virginia Pitsley, who's enabled us to do this series in honor of her husband, Bill, and their son, Jay. So tonight, thank you all for having me. And I am delighted to be here in person. As was already said, the mission of our museum is to explore the contributions, history, and culture of Irish people in America, and to foster dialogue and exchange between America and Ireland today. By sharing our stories, we strive to create connections and community between all Americans, because we appreciate and study the universality of the immigrant story in American history. So Irish immigrants, of course, have been coming here since this country's inception under colonial rule. Many of them naturally were impoverished and desperate for a new life. Many of the immigrants lived under British rule at home in Ireland with anti-Catholic laws, which really had come in during the Penal Laws and the Statutes of Kilkenny since the 1300s. So this experience might have contributed to their awareness of injustice in their new country. Naturally, many of the causes that the Irish initially got involved with here in America were ones which affected them directly. Access to education or healthcare, especially in the face of prejudice against Catholicism, but also political access and labor issues. And I think in February, I probably spoke about labor more and the suffrage movement. So tonight I'm going to look at a couple of different leaders. And the first one is Thomas Dongan. I'll just mention him briefly. He was the first royal governor, British royal governor, because of course the Dutch had colonized New York. He was born in County Kilkenny in 1634, the son of a member of the Irish Parliament, but they fell out of favor a little bit because they were Catholic. So strangely, they were able to maintain their lands. And he rose through through ranks and government appointees under the agency of James Stuart. Stuart was at the time the Duke of York, and he sent Colonel Dongan to America in 1682 to serve as governor. Dongan was granted large tracts of land on Staten Island, where he built a mansion, and other lands in New York. And then in 1683, he set up New York's first representative assembly, granted the Dutch Van Rensselaer family the royal patent in 1684, and he established both New York City and Albany in 1686. So he was the last proprietary and the first royal governor, and he literally put Albany on the colonial map by granting this small community with about 500 residents a city charter. And this document was incredibly ahead of its time. It stated, for the better establishing the government of this province of New York, and that justice and right may be equally done to all persons within the same. The people are mentioned for the first time in American history in this document written by an Irish immigrant, anticipating and probably inspiring the democratic spirit which a century later was to permeate the Constitution. So he allowed for an assembly and a council to meet. The assembly, he said, shall be the sole judge of the qualification of its members. And then he went on to lay out some rights. This is the charter. No one shall be punished unless found guilty after due process of the law and by a jury of his peers. No taxes shall be levied without the consent of the assembly. A lot of these words are going to be very familiar to you. No soldiers or sailors shall be quartered on the inhabitants except during actual warfare. Martial law shall not be proclaimed. No court shall sell a man's property without his consent. And finally, and perhaps more importantly, particularly for a Catholic who had lived in penal law Ireland, that no person or persons which profess faith in God by Jesus Christ shall at any time be in any ways molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any difference in opinion or matter of religious concernment who do not actually disturb the civil peace of the province, but that all and every such person or persons may from time and at all times freely have and fully enjoy his or their judgments or consciences in matters of religion, they behaving themselves peaceably and quietly. Later on, this was expanded to include Jewish communities, but it's amazing that in the 1600s, this freedom of religion was established. So Dongan showed himself to be a ruler of broad mind and rare executive abilities, much more than normal colonial governors had. He built his laws on basically the broad foundation of the Magna Carta. So inhabitants were loyal citizens of England, but he elevated the colony from a dependency to an integral part of the mother country. The principle of no taxation without representation, the slogan which rallied colonists to the cause of independence, was first enunciated in his charter. So New York took its place by the side of Virginia and Massachusetts and surpassed them both in terms of religious tolerance. Later on, that assembly also passed an act for the naturalization of foreigners so that all Christians could receive the privileges of citizenship by taking an oath of allegiance. So Thomas Addis Emmett was another civic-minded and inclusive person. Probably you know his brother, Robert, a little bit more. But Emmett became the legal advisor to the Society of United Irishmen, which was at home a unification of Presbyterian radicals and Catholics. They were a secret organization, non-sectarian and military, but their objectives were parliamentary reform based on universal male suffrage. They wanted Catholic emancipation and the elimination of British rule in Ireland. The Dublin Corporation issued a declaration of Protestant ascendancy in 1792. Thomas Addis Emmett and his brother Robert drew up the counter-manifesto of the United Irishmen, and in 1795 he took the oath of the society in open court. So the British government enacted then 3 statutes to try to crush this movement: the Insurrection Act, the Suspension of Habeas Corpus, and the Martial Law Act. So the Society of United Irishmen, who were inspired now by the American and French revolutions, planned an uprising. However, before they could kick off the hostilities, the leaders of the society, including Thomas Addis, were arrested on charges of treason and conspiracy and were imprisoned. A later uprising took place that summer, but was easily put down in a matter of days. This Emmett was released from prison in 1802 on the condition of permanent exile to any country not at war with England. So they're supposed to stay away from France. But Emmett moved to France and supported his younger brother Robert in planning another uprising. And then in 1803, Thomas learned that Robert had led the second failed rebellion and was hanged by British authorities. He emigrated to America. Upon his arrival here, he sought admission to the New York bar, and with his application was opposed by the leading Federalists of the times because he was an alien revolutionary. Abraham van Vechten moved in the New York Supreme Court of Judiciary for an order to admit Emmett to the bar, arguing that because the New York statute regarding attorney admission required neither an oath nor an oath of allegiance, Emmett's alienism was no bar to admission to the legal profession. And so he was admitted to practice law in 1805. He served as Attorney General of New York in 1812, and he was by universal consent in the first rank of American advocates. He returned to private practice a little bit later in life, and the New York law reports indicate that he argued over 300 cases before the New York Court of Chancery and the New York Supreme Court. Emmett argued cases in the Supreme Court, including Gibbons versus Ogden, 60 Pipes of Brandy, and the Schooner Andaline. He was retained to argue cases throughout this young nation. He died in 1827 while arguing actually in the New York Circuit Court. And his associates his ancestors went on to become a very famous human rights lawyer who was killed actually in the Bataclan attack in France a few years ago. So this is Margaret Hawgory. She was known as the Angel of the Delta, or the Mother of Orphans. And we're going from high society now down to one of the lowest immigrants that could come in. She was an illiterate Irish washerwoman who faced terrible misfortunes and bad luck in her life with grit and charity. She dedicated her life to orphans, the poor, and displaced. To finance her generosity, she embarked on a remarkable career. She was a servant and peddler, kind of washerwoman initially, and then she became a businesswoman and philanthropist through a dairy and business baker. She was a baker. She left Ireland when she was about 5 in 1818 which was known as the year without a summer. The crops had failed, the Gaffneys were starving, and as Margaret pointed out, her father was an uncompromising foe of Saxon rule. It took 6 months for them to arrive in America, and they eventually settled in Baltimore. They were still destitute when the yellow fever took her sister and soon after her parents. A brother just disappeared and was never heard from again. So by the age of 9 and 4 years into this country, Margaret was alone, an orphan, working as a house servant and peddler to support herself. She was 21 when she married a fellow immigrant, Charles Hawgory, and in 1835, the couple moved to New Orleans because actually he had tuberculosis and they thought the warmer weather would be good for him. And she had a daughter, Frances. The Irish would become a major force in that city, but in the 1830s, Margaret and Charles faced the resentment directed at the new wave of immigrants. Vicious prejudice was reserved particularly for Irish women, who were sometimes perceived as ugly and mannish, very obstinate. And they were, a lot of them worked as maids and they were nicknamed Bridgets. In 1837, a fiction piece in the Daily Picayune paper called for the mock trial of an Irish woman too drunk to be around decent folk, so she was sent to the House of Correction. And this was a humorous article. So Margaret was a stranger still in this city when her husband died, and months later, the ultimate tragedy struck. Her infant daughter died of sudden infant death syndrome, they think. A widow, and now as well buried her only child. She really fought against her faith and her faith. And she said, "My God, thou hast broken every tie. Thou hast stripped me of all. Again, I am all alone." So a formidable figure, a nun, Sister Regis Barrett of the Sisters of Charity, came to this 23-year-old impoverished widow and gave Margaret free room and board. She helped her to channel her grief by directing her to work at the orphan asylum. And this was her salvation, the beginning of her life as the mother of orphans. She worked as a laundress at the elegant St. Charles Hotel and divided her time between washing sheets there and giving her wages and her love to the orphans at the asylum. To secure more clothing and food, she went from street to street begging, and this was her greatest mission, fundraising. She once went into a grocery store asking for donations for the children. A cheeky clerk said he would only give her as much as she could carry. A few minutes later, she returned with a wheelbarrow and stocked it with enough supplies for months and wheeled it unaided back to the orphanage. Margaret wanted to be sure that children always had enough milk, so she used her savings to buy 2 cows. She milked the cows, feeding the children, and then sold the surplus milk, which she drove around the French Quarter. With the profits from her milk truck, she started a dairy with 19 cows. So this woman who couldn't read or write, the woman who owned 2 dresses, had become a savvy entrepreneur. She would in time buy land, businesses, and machinery, and took on the all-male business community with lawsuits and injunctions. It helped that she was a widow, because married women were not allowed to own property in their own name. And she was known throughout New Orleans for her benevolence. The profits she saw from her business went into constructing more orphanages and shelters. So the dairy was one success, and then she bought a failing bakery and created Margaret Hawgory and Company, the first steam bakery in the South, which became one of the largest bakeries in the country. She expanded her products to cakes, crackers, cookies, flour, and even macaroni, which I don't know how much the Irish knew about macaroni back in the day. But she increased profits not by raising prices, but by expanding production. A visitor at the time watched the company in action, men carrying drums of flour into the bakery, while others came out of the warehouse with barrels of bread and crackers. Always a practical woman, she co-invented a more efficient oven and discovered a way to package crackers, which would keep them fresher for weeks. She was now called the Bread Lady, and she personally delivered bread to the poor of New Orleans. When yellow fever hit New Orleans, the epidemic took 8,000 lives, and more lay ill and dying. This was the disease that had claimed her family, But Margaret went from house to house, nursing the victims regardless of race or means, and promised dying mothers that she would be a mother to their children, a promise she kept. During the Civil War, she helped to feed the city, defied the curfew and the Union Army. Apparently, there's a story in the middle of a battle, she attempted to pass a barrier to feed the starving citizens, and she was stopped by the infamous Benjamin Butler, who was the Union general. "You are not to go through the barrier without my permission. Is that clear?" he said. "Quite clear," Margaret replied, and walked through the barrier. The following year, during the siege of Port Hudson, she was brazen enough to solicit and receive donations for her orphanages from the Union Army. So naturally, the epidemic and the war filled New Orleans orphanages, prompting Margaret to construct 7 more, including St. Elizabeth's Asylum, which was later the home of Irish-American author Anne Rice. Her orphanages were ecumenical and inclusive, open to Black and white, Protestant, Catholic, and Jews, and no questions asked about paternity. She died in 1888 at the age of 69 and was honored with a state funeral. The city shut down. 2 governors, a mayor, and an archbishop were her pallbearers. Crowds of people, including every orphan in New Orleans, lined the street to pay tribute as her cortege passed by. The Times-Picayune was outlined in black borders and ran an obituary on the front page titled "Our Margaret." The people of New Orleans recognized true Christianity when they saw it and turned out en masse to do it reverence when they followed Margaret to the grave, said the paper. Soon after her death, the city erected a monument. Only one other statue to a woman existed in the country at the time. When it was completed, Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant orphans came from every asylum in the city to dedicate the monument and the park, Margaret's Place. Margaret's Place survived Hurricane Katrina, but time had done damage. And so in 2015, the citizens of New Orleans raised funds for its restoration and refurbished the park and statue. In her native Leitrim, a county to which she had never returned, they restored her home place and they welcomed tours to walk in Margaret's footsteps. Her institutions survive today as homes for the elderly and infirm. So this immigrant, illiterate washerwoman left an estate of 50,000, roughly 1.2 million in today's money, all of which she left to charity. And she signed her will with an X. The Dispatch newspaper was first published in 1846 by J. Heron Foster. And in 1846, news of Zachary Taylor's army crossing the Rio Grande was the first Sunday edition of a newspaper in Pittsburgh. In 1865, 2 employees, Alexander Rook and Daniel O'Neill, purchased half interest in the paper. And when Foster died 2 years later, they brought the full interest. The building was destroyed by fire in 1876, and Rook and O'Neill took the opportunity to build a new office with updated printing technology, which could double the size of the 4-page newspaper. The Dispatch began to utilize the perfecting press method, which allowed printing on both sides of a smaller sheet of paper. This was a style unique to Pittsburgh and rare within the United States. Daniel O'Neill was born at Cochran in County Wexford on New Year's Day in 1830. His father, Hugh O'Neill, was principal of a school there. His mother was Kate Navin, and he was the eldest of 12 children. His interest in journalism began at an early age at home in Ireland, and he was a contributor to the Wexford Independent. He immigrated during the famine just at the end in 1851 and settled in Pittsburgh, becoming the editor and eventual owner of this newspaper. So whereas other papers utilized the same Associated Press wires to fill their pages, the Dispatch had correspondence posted nationwide, as well as a London bureau to report on international news. The Dispatch also famously employed Elizabeth Cochran, another Irish American, a female journalist who, under the name Nelly Bly, wrote about the plight of working women and reported from Mexico as a correspondent during the 1880s. Nelly Bly was born in Pennsylvania on the turmoil of the American Civil War in a small township named in honor of her family, Cochran's Mills. She was the granddaughter of Robert Cochran, who had arrived in the fledgling United States from Derry in 1790. Her father rose to prominence as member of the judiciary, but he died tragically when she was only 6, and so the family struggled financially. Given the experience that she had so far endured in her young life, it was little wonder that a condescending article entitled "What Girls Are Good For" in the Pittsburgh Dispatch provoked a fiery response from the young Elizabeth, who penned a letter to the editor dramatically signed "Lonely Orphan Girl." The editor was so impressed with her rebuttal that he ran an ad asking whoever wrote it to come forward and identify herself. Meeting Elizabeth and impressed with her spirit, he offered her a job. And it was customary for women writers to write under a pseudonym. The editor suggested Nelly Bly, which was the subject of a popular Stephen Foster song. When it went to print, Nelly, N-E-L-L-Y, was accidentally changed to Nelly with an I-E, and the famous writer was born. Showing her spirit for adventure, Bly traveled to Mexico despite knowing no Spanish, and she lived among the Mexican people, sending back reports on their daily lives. Her streak as a crusader manifested itself now, and she had to flee the country before being arrested for criticizing the government of the dictator Diaz. Her dispatches were later compiled into a book entitled 6 Months in Mexico. Despite proving herself as an investigative reporter, Bly found herself giving nothing more than domestic topics to write on despite her protests. One day, her editor came into the newsroom to find a note from Bly saying, "I'm off for New York. Look out for me." So she joined the staff of the New York World, where she remained for the next 11 years. It was here that she met Joseph Pulitzer, another immigrant, the paper's owner and manager, and of course, who the prizes for journalism are still named. He encouraged her to focus on sensational stories that would increase the circulation of his paper, and Bly was willing to go to lengths that many journalists shied away from. Most of her pieces had broad appeal and often sparked a public outcry against injustices. But her first major scoop was an expose on the mistreatment of patients at Blackwell's Island Women's Lunatic Asylum, in which she feigned madness to gain admission to the facility. She practiced a, quote, faraway expression in the mirror and stopped practicing personal hygiene. She dressed in tattered secondhand clothes and checked herself into a boarding house for women, where she began looking for a non-existent trunk and shouting. Within 24 hours, these outbursts had the residents calling the police in fear of their lives. A judge remanded Bly to Bellevue Hospital psychiatric ward, where the chief doctor diagnosed her as, quote, delusional and undoubtedly insane. And she was committed to Blackwood Island. She was incarcerated for 10 days and witnessed the harsh manner in which the nurses and doctors in institutions abuse their charges. Quote, they inject so much morphine and chloral that the patients are made crazy. I have seen the patients wild for water from the effect of these drugs, and the nurses would refuse it to them. I have heard women beg for a whole night for one drop, and it was not given them. I myself cried for water until my mouth was so parched and dry that I could not speak. She wrote of spoiled food, lack of warm clothing, and the treatment of ice-cold baths simulating drowning. The matrons were abusive. Some were actually inmates from the penitentiary that was also housed on the island, and they regularly beat and choked the patients. Even worse were prolonged periods of social isolation. Bly wrote, take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up, and make her sit from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. on straight back benches. Do not allow her to talk or move during these hours. Give her no reading, and let her know nothing of the world or its doings. Give her bad food and harsh treatment, and see how long it will take to make her insane. 2 months would make her a mental and physical wreck. More concerningly, Bly found that many of the women confined at the asylum were sane. One patient was a German woman whose only malady was that she had such a thick accent that she had been diagnosed as speaking gibberish. Some were inconvenient wives whom their husbands had put away. Ominously, Bly dropped her insane act once she had achieved her goal of being actually admitted, and she found, quote, the more sanely I talked and acted, the crazier they told me I was. It was clear that once a woman was committed, it was virtually impossible to be released. After 10 days, finally, the lawyers for the World newspaper appeared to the court order for her release. Her expose behind asylum bars later became the book 10 Days in a Madhouse, became a nationwide sensation, and Bly was a national celebrity. The attention that she raised resulted in the appropriation of $1 million, a tremendous sum in the 19th century, for the annual budget of the treatment of mentally ill in New York City. The ease with which she had fooled the medical professionals, coupled with the grievous malpractices highlighted in her article, led to a grand jury investigation of Blackwell's. Over the next 10 years, she would go on to expose a litany of abuses in the city's jails, factories, orphanages, and tenements, usually while in disguise or operating under a false identity. She might best be remembered today for her 1889 attempt to circumnavigate the world and break the fictitious record of Jules Verne's Phileas Fogg. Around the World in 80 Days had been a smash hit, and Pulitzer was a keen supporter of the enterprise, realizing the unprecedented publicity it would attract. Her expedition did capture the imagination of the world, and she soon wasn't competing just against the clock, but also against a rival adventurer, Elizabeth Bisland from Cosmopolitan, who was dispatched in the opposite direction in the hopes of beating Bly. The New York World ran daily updates on her journey, saw her make her through Great Britain, France, where she met Jules Verne, Italy, Egypt, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Singapore, China, and Japan, before finally arriving back in the US. She landed in San Francisco 2 days behind schedule, but Pulitzer arranged for a chartered train dubbed the Miss Nelly Bly Special to take her to Chicago. She made her triumphal return to New Jersey in 1890 on January 25th to huge crowds. Her total journey was 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds, a new world record. But it was actually a close run thing. Her rival, Miss Bisland, had missed her steamship from Southampton and had to take a slower boat from Cove in Ireland, ensuring her defeat. Maybe the Irish had something to do with slowing it down. So she arrived back 4 days later. In 1895, at the age of 31, Bly married 73-year-old millionaire manufacturer Robert Seaman. That was an adventure. She retired from journalism due to her husband's failing health, and he died in 1904, leaving her in control of the Ironclad Manufacturing Company, which made steel containers. Bly went on to patent several inventions, and then she returned to journalism and covered World War I, also highlighting women's issues. So that's her in Europe during World War I. Samuel McClure was an Irish-American publisher who became known as the key figure in investigative or muckraking journalism. He co-founded McClure's magazine and ran it between 1893 and 1911. He ran numerous exposés, or at least published them, those written by Ida Tarbell, Ray Stannard Baker, and Lincoln Steffens. The magazine ran fiction and nonfiction by the leading writers of the day. Sarah Jewett, Mark Twain, Joel Chandler Harris, Jack London, Stephen Crane, and Willa Cather. He was born in 1857 in Ireland, in County Antrim, the eldest of 4 sons. He moved to America because his father died and the mother had to work washing clothes for a physician's family. The doctor who owned the home that his mother was working in had a large library, and he actually kind of allowed the young Samuel to go in and read 2 or 3 books a day, he said. I lay on the carpet face down and read for hours at a time. So McClure's mother married Thomas Simpson, who was a farmer, and Samuel McClure worked on the farm. But he was keenly interested in bettering himself, and he attended high school. But during the winter months, McClure could not afford a coat, so he ran to school to keep warm. Speed was my overcoat. He finally worked at a school too and clerked in a grocery store, and then worked as a printer's devil for the local newspaper. Then eventually he launched his own magazine in 1893. He printed in that first edition 20,000 copies, and 12,000 were returned. But he managed to keep the magazine in circulation because of Arthur Conan Doyle, who actually supported him financially. He saw himself as an open-minded individual with a natural enthusiasm for his work and a willingness to hire staff with little experience, which is where he got people like Booth Tarkington, Stephen Crane, and Rudyard Kipling. Viewing some of Ida Tarbell's writing in 1893, he is supposed to have said, "That girl can write. I want to get her to do some work for the magazine." So his magazine, eventually, the circulation rose to 250,000. And of course, they were massively involved during the Gilded Age in taking down some of the, the Standard Oil and all these trusts. He eventually had to sell the magazine, which was unfortunate, in 1914. He lost his role as editor in 1912, but he did continue to work in journalism. He became associated with the peace movement during World War I, but didn't prevent America joining in 1917. In 1921, McClure wrote a book about politicians' failures regarding that First World War, and he died in 1949 in a hospital in the Bronx. Now, this next activist is probably one of the ones that is the least known, and she formed an unlikely alliance with another mother. Historian Maurice Casey is one of the few writers who has really written about this woman, Mary Mooney, an 84-year-old woman from Mayo. In 1932, stood on stage before thousands in New York's Coliseum Theatre. Weary from travel and suffering with an illness, Mooney was unable to speak clearly as she stood before the microphone, but everyone affectionately called her Mother Mooney. One reporter described the amazingly cosmopolitan audience cheering to see this Irish immigrant, with people climbing on chairs to catch sight of her. She was the mother of Irish-American radical Tom Mooney. He had been framed and imprisoned for alleged involvement in the 1916 San Francisco bombing. Those two prisoners, himself and Billings, had become subject of an international justice campaign. The visiting room of San Quentin prison hosted campaigners who wanted to meet this world-famous prisoner, including leading Irish activists like trade unionist Jim Larkin, the feminist Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, both who had come from Ireland. But beyond the prison walls, it was Tom's mother, Mary, who became one of the most recognizable faces for the campaign of his release. Born in Mayo in 1849, during the Great Hunger, she left for America in her teens and moved to Holyoke, Massachusetts, where she married a miner, and they went on to have 3 children. Her son then was imprisoned in 1916, and she was immediately suspect in the eyes of the authorities because of his revolutionary politics. She was in her 60s at this time. She dedicated the rest of her life to securing his release. In 1932, the International Red Aid called on its sections to link Tom Mooney's case to that of the Scottsboro Boys, a group of African-American teenagers falsely accused of rape and sentenced to death as a means of breaking the walls of racial prejudice. The initial Scottsboro trial of 9 young boys had concluded in 3 days with an entirely white male jury. The sentence of death by electrocution was delivered for teenagers, the youngest of whom was 13, prompted a campaign for a reprieve and retrials. So Mary was enlisted to travel the world from San Francisco to Moscow as part of this campaign. She spoke with Ada Wright and Viola Montgomery, who were both mothers of some of the boys, and Richard Moore, an African-Caribbean civil rights activist. She never saw her son freed from prison in her lifetime. Her funeral in September 1934, after a summer of labor unrest in San Francisco, was attended by thousands, with obviously the absence of her son. Her casket was placed in the city's civic auditorium with the banner, "Mother Mary, we will finish your fight," hanging in the hall. Tom Mooney was pardoned and released from San Quentin in 1939. In November 2013, the state of Alabama's parole board granted a posthumous pardon to the last of the 3 Scottsboro boys who did not live to see their exoneration. But the role played by this immigrant from Mayo in a global campaign for justice remains a little-known story. And then finally, bringing us to modern times, Samantha Power. Samantha draws on her Irish roots in her book, The Education of an Idealist. She moved from Ireland aged 9 to America with her mother and younger brother. As a new immigrant with a love of sports, she thought that would help her fit in easily and she practiced speaking American in front of a mirror and tried to incorporate new slang. In an interview with Irish American magazine, Power credited her Irish heritage for her work in humanitarian causes. I think being Irish made me more interested in what was going on elsewhere in the world. It made me less insular and very interested in current events, war, and conflict resolution. She graduated from Yale and then enrolled in Harvard Law School, where she kept an all-consuming focus on Bosnia, returning twice to Sarajevo during that war. She took time off to teach courses in foreign policy and human rights at Harvard's Kennedy School before graduating from law school in 1999. So she won a Pulitzer Prize for her work, and then she was introduced to a senator at the time, Barack Obama. Eventually, in his second term, Obama tapped her to be US ambassador to the United Nations. Her friends had told her that the hardest part of working with Obama would be taming my outspokenness. They did become good friends, and Obama often praised her values and goals. But as the ultimate decider on policy risks versus advantages, he told her more than once, "You get on my nerves." In a similar vein, while at the UN, the Mexican ambassador once told her she had to decide whether she was a diplomat or an activist. "You can't be both," he insisted. She replied, "I am both. We should all be both." So she, struggled to keep up with her idealism as well as, of course, the politics. But she worked at the UN in Security Council meetings. There were 263 sessions in her first year. Originally, Obama had set a red line on using chemical weapons during Syria's civil war, and he threatened airstrikes. Later retreating, he decided that he needed Congress's approval first. He did not get it, but her council resolution passed. "I secured the strongest deal possible in circumstances where our leverage had been badly dented," she said. Obama assured her, "I don't know anyone who cares more about people, and I couldn't be prouder of you." He said when he nominated her as the USAID administrator, "Samantha will rally the international community and work with our partners to confront the biggest challenges of our time, including COVID-19, climate change, global poverty, and democratic backsliding." A crisis-tested public servant and diplomat, Ambassador Power has been a leader in marshalling the world to resolve long-running conflicts, respond to humanitarian emergencies, defend human dignity, and strengthen the rule of law and democracy. So all of these immigrants or descendants of immigrants have used their power and their voice to advocate for the powerless, to speak for the voiceless. As Samantha Power once said, "You asked about justice, and I guess the best of the Irish humanitarian tradition was found through missionary work, through the best of the church." So growing up there in Ireland, there was some sense of being part of a global community, of being connected to people and doing unto others as you'd have done unto yourself. All of that was in the mix. Historian Timothy Marr has argued that communal loyalty is the driving force of Irish diaspora life. It was very important that the community succeeded and were united rather than any individual. This is often kind of in contrast with the mighty American individualism that's lauded. And while early Irish immigrants that joined in unions and stuff sometimes admitted only the Irish, on the whole, Irish Americans work for the greater good and not for the individual. That's something that we hope we're continuing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Do I have a mic? Frank? Does anyone have any questions? Oh, Dr. Okay.
Loads of them. So someone. Thank you. Mhm. Mhm. I think you raise an interesting point. You know, I was raised to not talk about sex, religion, or politics, and I'm going to talk about all of them tonight. No, exactly. But you know, I actually do feel very strongly about that. You know, I think those recent immigrants that were moved from one state to another and given falsified documents. You know, I tweeted on the museum's account, imagine if our ancestors in 1847 who were lucky to get off a coffin ship, you know, most of them died on the journey. And so if you had been given, you know, false paperwork by state authorities in those days, what would we have said? And so I do think it's incumbent upon us, you know, there's plenty in this city, in this country, particularly in those instances that we saw at the weekend. Those are asylum seekers. They've done everything correctly. Like there is a system and they're in the system and they're applying correctly. I'm an immigrant. It's very difficult to come in here the right way. You know, I've been here since 2009. My green card still hasn't been processed. So there's a lot of misinformation out there about undocumented workers and different immigrants and refugees. And I think it is incumbent upon us as diaspora to stand up for them and to point out, you know, where the needs are and where they can be helped. And the benefit that different peoples and cultures bring to this country. Everybody just wants to come here for a better life. They don't come here to use, you know, the system or to take advantage of anything. I can tell you as an immigrant on 3 different kinds of visas, you don't get anything. You have to work. You know, you're not signed up to be given social welfare. It doesn't happen. You don't have healthcare if you're not in the system. And so nobody wants to come here to take advantage of anything. They want to contribute. And that was our story for 400 years. And we were given that chance. And I think it's very important that we try and share that chance with others when we can. Mm-hmm. So we didn't talk about sex yet, but we'll get to that later. You had a question. Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us the name of Margaret in New Orleans?
Yes, Hawgory, which I'm sure I'm, you know, saying that horribly. It's Haughey. So the Irish tend to say like Hoff instead of Hawk, you know. So I'm calling it Hawgory. But yeah, welcome. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. I'd love to, thank you. So the museum is about 35 years old. We were founded by the Irish American Legislators Society, and we're chartered by the Department of Education, the State Department of Education. So it's very important to us, you know, that we're not a propaganda kind of machine. We do our best to teach about not only the past, but also current events like Brexit and the border poll and, you know, where are we with unification in Ireland. So we've moved just during COVID and we're in a city-owned building. There's a large permanent exhibition and then we rotate at the front. So we talk about the Irish in politics, in culture, in sports and education and religion, and then we hold a lot of talks. So at the moment, you know, we have a series that is talking about the Irish War of Independence and the Civil War. We're celebrating the 100th, well, celebrating is the wrong word, but we're commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Civil War at the moment. We also have a Great Hunger series, and all of these are available to watch on our YouTube channel or our website. You know, we try to do this hybrid. This is the best one I've seen, by the way. We don't have cameras. We're usually on a laptop. But the Zooms and, you know, I think has really opened up our audience. So we're not just in Albany. We're actually the only kind of national Irish American museum. So we encourage you all to come down to Albany, but at least check out the website, which is irish-us.org. Oh, I forgot we have one more slide. Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments? I think I've scared you all now. And I don't know if the cheese and crackers are brought out yet, so you do have time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to present you with one of our pins.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, it's our symbol
No?
that is at the Bonnie Street Cemetery on the main stone there.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
good.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you very
thank
much.
you. I want to thank Dr. Stack. It was very interesting to learn. She covered quite a bit of ground with religious freedom, adopted children, mental health, peace movement, civil rights, human rights, and just recognizing our community. I appreciate everyone being here. I don't think I properly welcome the people on Zoom. So I hope you were able to enjoy this lecture as much as we were. And thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy some appetizers, and the bar is open. Thank you.